I wanted to dispel this long-standing myth that there were 4 centuries of silence before Jesus. Um, these centuries were anything but silent. God was still very active, very vocal, and there was still a lot of prophetic activity and a lot of biblical literature,
Mm.
as well as extra biblical literature. But a
Mhm.
lot of biblical literature was written during this period, and that comes as a surprise to many people. It even sounds like a wrong idea, but when we study the biblical texts and the history, the culture, all the circumstances, the contexts which gave rise to the biblical literature, we realize that a good chunk of the Old Testament comes from this period. And in fact, the Old Testament period extends all the way to Jesus. There's no stop and then a hiatus, so there's no interim period between, or a so-called intertestamental period. I hate that term. I want to get rid of it.
Yeah,
I want to
that's
bury it,
good.
Yeah.
as it's a dirty word. I just feel like I need a shower right now just after saying it. But the I wanted to dispel this myth
Mm.
of 4 centuries of silence and just show people, well, where did that idea come from?
Mm.
And if it's not true, then what actually happened, and how does that affect our understanding of both the Old Testament and the New?
Yeah.
I wonder if you can actually dive in a little bit more to this myth. Where did this myth come from? In
Yeah.
fact, I thought about starting our podcast today with a bad joke, saying we're here to interview a scholar on the intertestamental period, the 400 years of silence. And in honor of these years of silence, for 400 seconds, we won't say anything, and then we'll say goodbye. Thank you for joining us. Nothing happened.
Well, I'm
So
glad you didn't start that way, Matthew.
that would have been pretty bad. So, before we really start diving into a lot of what is happening in this
Mhm.
time period, can we first, where did this myth come from that this is
Yeah.
400 years of silence? Why is this continued to be taught as just a standard, let's teach the Old Testament story, 400 gap year situation, and then New Testament?
Yeah, it's actually a tragic irony. The idea itself, 400 years of silence, stated that way, doesn't arise until probably 200 AD,
Wow.
roughly at the earliest.
Hmm.
And it actually comes from rabbinic circles. So the rabbis were the heirs of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were really the only Jewish sect that managed to survive the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. And the rabbis were their heirs. And because the early church was predominantly Jewish, the early church presented many challenges to Jews who didn't believe that Jesus was Israel's Messiah. And so the rabbis were wrestling with that very idea, along with many other ideas. But partly in answer to Christian claims about Jesus, they stated that the Holy Spirit fell silent uh, roughly during the time of Artaxerxes and with the prophet Malachi. And they dated that to roughly 400 BC or thereabouts. And this came about partly to challenge and counter the Christian claims that Jesus was the Messiah. So this idea that the Holy Spirit fell silent was addressing the Christian claim that Jesus could not have, Jesus could not have been the Messiah. He certainly wasn't even a prophet. He couldn't have been because God stopped sending prophets and stopped speaking prophetically centuries before Jesus came along. There was more to it than just the Christian claims, but the overt statement of this belief comes from roughly AD 200, and so it's oddly enough an anti-Christian polemic in part, which tragically and ironically Christians have
I was
perpetuated
gonna say, yeah.
ever since. Yeah, and so I hear this idea preached from pulpits that there was 400 years silence, and yet it's an anti-Christian polemic. It's a very odd thing. The seeds of this idea go back, however, to roughly the 2nd century BC, and it has to do with the rise of the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmoneans were a family of priests. You might know them as the Maccabees, who led a Jewish revolt against the Greek rulers of Judea at the time. And eventually, in 142 BC, they managed to gain independence for the Jews. And as they established their state, the Jewish state, at the helm of this state was the high priest, Simon, and he was the last remaining Maccabee brother. There were 5 brothers who were involved in the revolt, and he was the last man standing. And he was given power as head of state, as a high priest. Now, theologically, that presented a bit of a problem, because the prophetic traditions say that God was committed to ruling Israel through a Davidic dynasty. And if we go to 2 Samuel 7, we read about God's promises to David to raise up David's heir, and for God to rule through the Davidic heir as his son, and God would be the father of the Davidic ruler. To put it another way, God committed himself to entering the Davidic dynasty as the father figure and ruling through a son figure. And so, according to that theology, having a Davidic king is a non-negotiable. This is how God rules Israel. He himself is a member of the Davidic dynasty. And so if you don't have a Davidic descendant ruling the Jewish state, then theologically there are major problems. And so there seems to have been quite a bit of dispute in Jewish circles about what kind of power the high priest would have. According to Davidic theology, the high priest, any priest really, is an employee of the Davidic king. He shouldn't be ruling the country. And yet here was Simon, the high priest, ruling the country and being given power to do so in perpetuity, and then power would be passed to his sons. It was effectively a ruling dynasty. And so in the constitutional document that the Jewish nation put together in 140 BC, a clause, the opponents of Simon managed to get a clause into the constitution that said Simon can rule in perpetuity until a reliable prophet arises. And the New Testament identifies that prophet as John the Baptist. And John the Baptist then pointed to someone who came after him, a Davidic descendant named Jesus, as the one who would lead the people of Israel to a new kingdom in accordance with God's promises. But going back to Simon and the Hasmonean dynasty, they, of course, didn't believe that God would overthrow them in favor of a Davidic descendant. By this time, the Davidic descendants were just ordinary people. They were laymen. A couple of centuries later, they are just tradesmen in Galilee. They're not in the corridors of power anymore. And so the whole idea that the high priest would give up his power in favor of who knows who from a Davidic dynasty that last ruled 4 centuries earlier just seemed ridiculous to them. And so they started to argue that they themselves, the priests, were the fulfillment of God's purposes, God's promises to Israel. Israel was a kingdom of priests, or in this particular case, the kingdom of a priest, the high priest. And so the Hasmoneans started to suppress the idea that God was still sending prophets at all. He didn't need to, according to them, because the priests were everything that Israel needed. And so anyone who claimed to have a prophetic message eventually was suppressed. And we have some evidence from ancient sources which talk about a couple of prophetic figures who were actively suppressed by the Hasmonean dynasty. And so the priestly circles and the Sadducees, who were largely aligned with the high priest and were basically a priestly group, started to proclaim the idea that prophecy had ceased. God was not sending any more prophets, and the priests and priestly leadership was God's intention for Israel all along, and here they were. No one need look any further than the priests. And so that's where the idea started, and it gained momentum. Any Jewish group that gained power started to use the idea that God was either not sending prophets at all, or he wasn't sending very many of them, because We don't want prophets to speak out against us and critique the power that we have. And so in that way, the idea started as an anti-Davidic hope ideology. And it snowballed from there until a few centuries later, we have the overt statement from the rabbis that God stopped sending prophets in the 5th or 4th century BC.